touch a little bit on the temperance movement. And if I start to get off time here, let me know. Okay.
I just have a side comment.
Sure.
My grandmother was Irish, Lucille Bess Barrett, and she graduated. She was born 1897, so the early 1900s she graduated from OU.
Oh.
So Maggie probably paved the way for my grandmother to be able to go to OU. I think that's amazing.
Excellent, yeah. Well, we often, when we think of the temperance movement and prohibition specifically, you know, we think of those early 1900s, but really this went all the way back into the 1800s. And here in Coshocton, the Crusades, they called it prayer work or the Woman's Whiskey War, dates back to February 15th, 1874. And I just thought I would read a little bit here from Hunt's history because it touches on Mrs. David Spangler. And the interesting thing is, to this day, I still can't find out what her first name was. Just she goes by Mrs. David Spangler. I found a photograph of a Helen Spangler, but that was his brother's wife. So I still don't know what her, and even the folks at Grace Church, I've not found anybody there that knows because they deeded the land for the Grace Church to be built on. But anyhow, let's see. On the evening of that day, which would have been February 15th, a Sunday, a mass meeting of the Friends of Temperance in the village of Coshocton was held in the Methodist Episcopal Church to consider the new movement and the propriety of inaugurating it here. The meeting was presided over by the mayor and addressed by a number of speakers, the general drift of whose remarks was in favor of the movement, already sweeping up from the southwestern part of the state and immensely written up in the newspapers. On the 21st of February, the visiting band of women led by the Venerable Mrs. David Spangler, after frequent conferences among themselves and direct or indirect conferences with those who professed that the secret of the Lord was with them and who knew that the Lord was in this movement and that all the pains and toils would be in light with the success was achieved, began their visitation to the saloons. The day was exceedingly stormy. Efforts were confined to pleading with those in the business to give it up. After some days, the prayer exercises were entered upon. Usually the ladies were allowed to come into the premises, the proprietor often, however, being out at the time. But at length the exercises were conducted upon the pavement, often in the chill March winds and amid the rain and snow. Meanwhile, public meetings were held every evening at which addresses were made by popular speakers, more or less in sympathy with the work, and relations of the experience of reformed drinkers and reports of the women's work were given in. At these great crowds were present, filling the largest rooms available, the Methodist Episcopal Church, Central Hall, the Presbyterian Church, the Opera House. Morning prayer meetings of large proportions also were held. At length, pickets were set in each drinking place or as a guard before the door. Two women, often closely blanketed with warm bricks at the feet, sat hour after hour until relieved by others, sent out by the officer of the day by the authority of the League. At length, after days of uneasiness and nights of anxiety and devising, the establishment, having the smallest stock and doing the smallest trade, surrendered, with the understanding that the liquor should be purchased by the League or its friends, and also the U.S. Internal Revenue license. And then followed another and another. The liquors were poured into the gutter. The brass band played. The church and courthouse bell rang. The men shouted, the women sang, and cried and prayed. Led by Mrs. Spangler. And as I said, she deeded the land that the Grace United Methodist Church was built on, and it's called the Grace Church at her suggestion, recommendation. And back in the 1970s, they had done some work on the bell tower up there, and the bell actually has her name inscribed on it. She had donated that bell back in the day. Florence Catherine Kemp. She grew up in Crawford Township near Baltic, but it was in Coshocton County. And in 1950, there were 17 women who paid $47 in tuition to go to Michigan State University in Lansing, at that time Michigan State College. Now, I think it would just be great if I could go someplace for $47 today in tuition, but they were the first students to enroll in the nursing program there. And it was Florence Catherine Kemp who was the first director of nursing at Michigan State University. She got the program started and oversaw it for several decades. A little bit about her life. She received her early education at Coshocton High School as well as Baltic. She then went to Lakeside Hospital for Nurses in Cleveland, received her bachelor's degree from Ohio State University, and in 1936 a master's from Columbia University. She authored several textbooks for nursing, including one on applied psychology to nursing that was used for decades in the profession. If you're ever in the local history room over at the library, they have some of her textbooks up there. Her contribution to the medical world as a nurse educator and an author won her recognition across the country. She was supervisor of science and clinical instruction and instructor of psychology at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, which is the third oldest hospital in the United States. Her career took her to the University of Michigan, Vanderbilt, Western Reserve School of Nursing, and on occasion she worked with Dr. George Cryle, who was one of the co-founders of the Cleveland Clinic. When appointed as the founding director of nursing education at Michigan State, she also was the only faculty person at that point in time. She not only was organizing the program, but she was the one doing the teaching. But under her guidance, that college grew into a department and into a school of nursing eventually. Today, more than 400 students go through that College of Nursing up there. They have 80, close to 100 faculty members. In 2000, which would have been the 50th anniversary of the college having been founded, the dean of the college at that time just simply said, that Florence Kemp would be so proud that something that she started had grown into something so big there. It's interesting, you would think of maybe all the professions that we could touch on of women here locally from a historical perspective, and things like teaching and all our whole stereotypical thoughts would come to mind, but jumping from nursing into science, Emma Perry Carr, she was born near Holmesville, but her family moved to Coshocton when she was very young, and she went to school at Coshocton, graduated from Coshocton High School. The family had very strong ties here. Both her father and her grandfather were doctors. Her sister was one of the organizers of the YWCA, so very instrumental. Well, she became very widely known for her work in chemistry. And if you think back to that time in the early 20th century, women weren't getting into chemistry. That just wasn't heard of. She went to Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, where she became head of the Department of Chemistry. She held that position for 35 years. And during that time, she was one of the very first people in the whole United States that used graduate students in her research. They researched hydrocarbons, which eventually led to high-octane fuel and use it in plastics and different things. The chemistry building there on Mount Holyoke College is named in her honor, Carr Laboratory. She was the first to receive the Francis Garvin Medal, which honors outstanding women in chemistry. And if you went on Google and did a search for Emma Perry Carr, it'll all pop up. That's how well known she was. August 18th, 1920. Does anybody know what happened that day? Ding, 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 ding. You all were allowed to vote. Up in the western end of Coshocton County, a 38-year-old woman grew up just west of Warsaw. And that very next year, after that ratification was completed, she decided that she was going to run for mayor of Nellie. She was one of 2 women in the state of Ohio to be the first ones to run for elected office after given the right to vote. The first time she was nominated on the independent ticket and was elected without opposition. 2 years later, she ran on the Republican ticket and defeated her brother. Anyone want to guess her name? It was Nellie. It was Nellie. Nellie Darling. She married a Moore, U.S. Moore, Ulysses Moore. But the village was named after her by her father, J.P. Darling. So that's why it was called Nellie. He was going to call it Darlington, but there were so many Darlingtons that the post office said no. So then he named it after his daughter, Nellie. And then she later became the mayor there then for a few years. She also had served on the village council later on for a period of time as well. Very nice-looking gal, was kind of the beau of the town, and she was one that was out there again, kind of paving the way after that the amendment was passed. One more that I had here. Mary Gammisfelder, this is from up my neck of the woods in the Blissfield area. She was a missionary to Africa, and she died there in 1937 in Ruru, Kenya, British East Africa. She was one of 12 children. Back in those days, families were big, and always wanted to be a missionary. In Ruru, there was no written language at the time, so she helped translate the New Testament so that the folks there would have it in their native language. They learned how to manufacture brick so they could build buildings. She taught them gardening and weaving. And her work was mostly directed among the women and the girls there. They built a home for her, a school, a girls' home, and then also a church, which is near where she's buried. In recent years, the home has served as a kitchen for a Presbyterian church that was built in 1958 after that original church was torn down. Now there's also an elementary and a secondary school there. But for many, many decades, the pulpit that Mary Gammisfelder used was very highly regarded, even into the modern times here. And a plaque that was hung on the wall that commemorated the work that she did in the early days of that mission. So, not only these examples of some of these women, kind of blazing the trail here locally, but they had their impact, all across the country, all across the world. When you think in, chemistry and the work that was done in hydrocarbons and that Emma Perry Carr did, and so forth. So lots to be proud of here in Coshocton.